So you're diagnosed for the first time, you're in remission, and then you get the second diagnosis because you've relapsed. So what was that like? What was that like emotionally for you and for the people around you?
It was very different when I relapsed. Obviously, the first time I didn't even know what leukemia was. This time I did, so there wasn't that shock. It was something I always knew could happen. So it was more of a, damn, just frustrating in a way, because there I was getting on with my life. It had been postponed, it had changed a bit, but it had been going pretty well. I had a job and a wife and a house and so on. It was more, it was frustration. And I think the hardest thing for me was that whereas the first time I was single, I thought, I can deal with this myself, because it's just my life, even though there were obviously people who cared about me, my friends and family. But when it came down to it, it was just sort of my life I was dealing with and that was in danger. Whereas when I relapsed, by then I was married, and suddenly it wasn't just my life, it was our life. And anything that happened to me and everything I was going through, my wife was going through as well.
So the first time around you had chemotherapy, obviously fairly intensive chemotherapy for a long time, but the second time, can you just tell us a little bit about what happened then and what the treatment looked like?
Okay. So when I relapsed, I knew, and the consultant told me very quickly, that I was going to need a stem cell transplant if I wanted to have any hope of keeping the leukemia away. But before having the transplant, which would also need a match and things, I needed to get into remission. There was a protocol which is usually used for ALL patients who have relapsed, which is called the FLAG-IDA treatment. It was chemotherapy again, more intensive chemotherapy. And the doctors were pretty hopeful that would get me into remission. So I had that and was in hospital waiting for the blood counts to get better, and waiting rather longer than we expected. And eventually it turned out that it hadn't done the job that we had hoped. So suddenly everything was uncertain again, because my treatment the first time around had used so many different chemotherapy drugs, and now I'd used more.
Right.
There were very few few chemotherapy options left to try to get rid of the leukemia this time. So my doctors were looking a bit worried, but they did say that there was someone at another hospital, one of the consultants who was involved in quite a lot of trials around leukemia, around acute lymphoblastic leukemia, particularly relapsed leukemia, and refractory leukemia, which is what it was now, because I'd relapsed and then not managed to get into remission with the normal treatment. So I was sent up, bundled off to another hospital to meet my new consultant, who told me about a few options. There was one that sounded particularly promising, but it wasn't going to open for another few months. And of course, at that point, a few months... You don't have a
lot of time.
No, it was too long. So luckily, there was another option. And the treatment was basically using antibodies to attack the specific leukemic cells. So I had more chemotherapy, but with antibodies as well. And it turned out to be quite a tough treatment, particularly because I was actually going from one side of London to the other 3 times a week, avoiding public transport because my immune system is very low, and having to persuade friends who were fantastic to drive me up there and drive me back. But it was really sort of taking a toll, knocking me out. And I didn't actually quite make it to the end, because near the end I sort of collapsed when I was at home, ended up being rushed into hospital, and missing my sort of final treatment, which was at the other hospital. Right. But to everyone's surprise, it got me into remission. So that was the good news. I was in remission. We could start thinking about the transplant. Now, the idea of a stem cell transplant is that your immune system hasn't managed to keep away the cancer. So by knocking out your bone marrow, your blood system, putting in a new one, using someone else's stem cells, which will grow into your new bone marrow and so on, then you can get a new immune system, which hopefully will be fresh and strong and be able to keep it away in a way that your own immune system didn't manage the first time. But for that, you do need a match. If there had been a related donor, one of my siblings, then we probably would have gone for it. But with an unrelated donor, it's a bit more risky. And at the time, the doctors were hopeful that just the chemotherapy and radiotherapy I had that first time round would keep the leukemia away. Now to come back, we needed to find an unrelated donor. And luckily, I had actually 3 10 out of 10 matches were found for me on the register. The second one, who was a few years older than the first one, all I knew was that he was a 30-year-old male living in the UK. I was 31 by then. So I thought, oh, that's quite nice. Yeah. And yeah, he was 10 out of 10 match, just sort of the perfect donor really for me. So I had the 6 days or so of intensive chemotherapy, which knocked me out. And then the day of transplant, which in some ways is actually quite underwhelming, really, because it's just a little bag.
They hook you up?
Yeah, they hook you up. I had a central line, a Hickman line in my chest, which is how I'd been having most of the chemo. And yeah, they just hooked that up. It dripped through in about 25 minutes, and that was that.
Wow.
But it wasn't enough for me, because I thought this is a day to celebrate, because it's my chance of more life, and a bonus life, I always think of it as. So I made sure my dad and my wife brought in a big balloon and party hats and some sort of sparkling elderflower cordial, because I wasn't really meant to be on the booze
champagne,
at that time. So we made it a celebration, because that's what I thought it should be. Exactly.
Yeah. Amazing.